Hey everyone, very good evening. Hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Vivek, let me know when we can start. How many attendees are there? Accordingly, we will continue.
Let's give her another 2 minutes and maybe we can start after that.
Sure, absolutely. Vivek, I hope you can see my screen.
We can see it image.
Right.
Yes.
Probably another 30 seconds and we'll start.
Just a moment.
I see people are joining in. Right, I think we should start. We've got around 20 plus attendees. Thank you everyone for joining in for the fifth session of the Navigating Net Zero series. Today we are talking about emission factors. Previously, we have spoken about the basics of carbon accounting. We've spoken about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And in one of the sessions, we've also spoken about BRSR, uh, the BSR reporting for India. And I think now we are in a position that we can deep dive into other things like emission factors. And we can talk about the various aspects of emission factors that are relevant for carbon calculations. So it's really important that we deep dive into the various aspects of it. But it is also important to refresh what you have done in the previous sessions, and more importantly on carbon accounting, because I think uh, the relevance is very important. Why are we talking about the emission factors and what's its importance? That is very important to discuss. When we look at the steps for carbon accounting that we discussed in the very first session, we said that we have to identify the emission sources for within the organizational boundary. Of course, this is after you have identified the organizational structure. That means all the sites within the organization, all the entities, be it subsidiaries, be it group companies, and whatever is part of your organization. Once you've identified that, you also identify the emission sources within you. You know, like for example, what are the activities that are happening within the organization? For example, if it is a manufacturing company, all the manufacturing related activities. In case of transportation, all transportation related activities. Are you burning some fuel? Are you purchasing a gas? Are you purchasing raw materials? whatnot, everything related to the company's activities, which would have an environmental impact or a carbon emission associated with it. Then you select the calculation approach. Are you talking about spend-based calculation, or you're talking about activity-based calculation? We'll briefly discuss that as well. And this would change the type of emission factor that you use. You also talk about the data collection, because in many cases, you don't have the right data for calculating the emissions, and there also your emission factor changes a bit. You also choose the emission factor database that you are going to use. It will be based on the type of activities. It will be based on the region that you are. It will be based on scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. Of course, we will discuss how these, there may be different databases for each of these scopes. So ultimately, it depends on the type of activity, which is fuel consumption, electricity usage, travel distances, of course. Some of them will be very common. Of course, if you use diesel or gasoline anywhere in the world, the emissions related to that will be same, unless and until you have a different method of producing the fuel. But mostly it will not be very different. It will be almost very same. On the other hand, in case of electricity, for an example, based on the region, the emissions uh, that you get because of electricity usage will be very different. Thereafter, also what you do is you put all of this together, put it in a calculator, and then ultimately you calculate the emissions of your organization, right? So you aggregate the data from different operations, you ensure that there is consistency in the units being used, in the period of reporting. So all of these are very relevant with respect to carbon accounting. And lastly, when you've done all of this, you publish the results into a sustainability report where you're also talking about how the emissions have changed over the years, what are your targets, or you may simply do a simple ESG accounting report. So this is what we discussed in the first presentation, and this is what the usual carbon accounting process would be. You can notice that the emission factor database has got a very important uh, place over here, and that is important in the entire journey. It's a very important milestone to choosing the right emission factor database or choosing the right emission factor itself within the database. So we'll talk about that as well. Quickly touching about the various carbon accounting principle, which are very important. First is relevance. So selection of the right emission category, and we have covered this in detail with for scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. I mean, you should know when to choose mobile emissions, and you should also know when to choose energy and fuel related emissions, right? Though both sound similar, but they are different. Choosing upstream and downstream and all those categories in scope 3, we've already discussed that. When to talk about finance emissions, where should it be entered? Should you treat finance emission as a group company or a subsidiary, or it should be a category 15 within the scope 3? All of these are very important questions, and I think relevance is very important. Completeness. So your carbon accounting has to be complete. You have to account for all the categories and not miss out any of them. It should be consistent, of course. You cannot say that I am reporting on, let's suppose, say, waste generation this year, but tomorrow I am not gonna do it. I mean, that's something that has to be consistent. It's the basics. Transparency in terms of, this could be in the form of a certificate, which most companies go for, wherein they go for an audit of the GHG emissions or the entire ESG report, and they say that it has been audited and all the emission factors are correct, all the conversions are correct, the way everything was collected was correct. So so it's one of the basic principles of accounting, and it has to be accurate. And this is where the emission factor come in. So ensuring that the conversion with respect to the activity or with respect to spend is very accurate. That is very important with respect to carbon accounting. So I think we have clearly established that emission factors have a very important place in the entire carbon accounting uh, journey for a particular company. Having said that, I think it is very important to know to how to choose the right emission factor or the emission factor database here in this particular case. So emission factor databases would change with respect to region. So for example, the has got US EPA, Europe has got, or rather UK has got UK DEFRA, India uses multiple, but primarily IEA, and for electricity it is CEA. So I mean, you can have a unified emission factor database. For an example, in case of the US, it is just one. All the regions use just one emission factor database, and it has got everything. Uh, as respect to India, wherein all the databases are not available. So for the electricity, you use Central Electricity Authority, but for anything else, you might use IPCC, you might use US EPA, or any other database that is available, which is relevant to you. Of course, we've just spoken about the databases, whichever is most applicable to you with respect to the database. Like, for example, somebody would want to use IPCC because that is very much in detail and it is mostly recognized across the world. So, I mean, based on the region and based on your preferences, you might use the database. Again, once you use a particular database, the consistency has to be there. So you cannot change. For example, in 2019, you choose US EPA, and tomorrow you chose to report through another database. That is something that is not acceptable. Of course, in the US, it is not possible, but in other regions where it is not clearly defined, it is definitely possible. Thereafter, of course, choosing the right emission factor database. The next step is choosing the right category. So, for example, in case of direct fuel combustion, you have emission factor which you can directly multiply with the fuel usage. We'll see how that happens. Or it can be activity related emissions also. For an example, even for the same fuel, you're also accounting in scope 3, category 3, the fuel and energy related, wherein you're accounting for the refining process of the fuel as well as being transported to the tank. So it is also called well to tank, which is one of the things that UK DEFRA releases, right? So it is important to know the right category and accordingly choose the right emission factor database. Like here in this particular case, when I mentioned, you might use a combination of USEP and UK DEFRA. And lastly, the methodology is also very important. So for an example, when you choose the electricity database, let's talk about in India. In India also, you might there are two categories rather. The methodology could be one with respect to whether you want to use renewable energy or not, or the other uh, with respect to whether you don't want to use renewable energy. And also with respect to what is your source, you might be purchasing for someone else. So these are known as, of course, location-based and market-based emissions or emission factors. So I think that is we've established pretty clearly that choosing the right emission factor database might be difficult in some cases if person is not very well aware of all of of these things, and which is why understanding the emission factor is very important. But of course, it is also very important first to understand scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, the various categories, where which is applicable and whatnot. So, of course, organizational structure as well. So, all of having established all of those, the next step is understanding the emission factor database and using the right one. So let's talk about the few things that we have already said. Like for an example, or rather, let's first talk about. I'm so sorry. So I included this particular slide purposefully because when we are talking about emission factor database, we are also talking about the various GHG gases. Of course, we are talking about the 7 gases that are accepted as per GHG protocol. And when we are talking about the emission factors, we are talking about emission factors for all of them. So a particular activity might produce a combination of these gases. So for example, in case of mobile combustion, you might always see methane nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide being produced. And it is very important to know when we are calculating to know all of these three, such that we can arrive on a carbon dioxide equivalent, which is what we have been discussing a lot over the last few presentations. So ultimately, what you are actually reporting is we are reporting the carbon dioxide equivalent, and just a crude example of how that would be calculated. So for an example, for an activity, you would want to understand what that activity is. So for an example, if I say in case of let's say electricity generation through diesel generator, there probably you will have the gallons which is being used or liters of diesel being used, that you multiply with the respective emission factors. And here in this particular case, it will be CO2, CH4, and N2O that will be available for you. And once you multiply these factors and the global warming potential, so for an example, in case of CO2, it will be directly 1. The amount of CH4 will be directly multiplied over here with respect to the emission factor of CH4 multiplied by the global warming potential. In case of N2O, it will be the emission factor of N2O multiplied by the amount, the activity or the amount of fuel usage over here multiplied by the global warming potential. And once you get the value of X, A, and B, which is the total of carbon dioxide equivalent, and that is what you report. The reason I brought it up is it is sometimes we kind of forget that we are talking about CO2 equivalent and we look for CO2 and we don't distinguish between these two. So it is sometimes we just find the CO2 value and we multiply it and we forget that there is CH4 and N2O values also that has to be accounted for. And we need to come out with a CO2 equivalent value. And that is very important in terms of completeness and accuracy of carbon calculation. So this is a very important step. Most of the carbon calculators have already integrated this automatically. So you don't have to actually look for the respective emission factors, and thereby your work is very simpler. Or if you are actually calculating on an Excel, you need to make sure that you have these factors for the particular activity stored somewhere and you're calling them with respect to the activity itself. So each time the activity will define which of these GHG gases need to be calculated for, and their respective global warming potentials have to be available to you so that you can arrive at a carbon dioxide equivalent value, which is what you're going to report anywhere. So it's really important to get this step very clear. I hope this is very clear to everyone. In any case, anybody has any question, you can put down all the comments. You can put down all the comments in the question and answer section, and we'll take it at the very last. All right. I was talking about the right emission factor to be chosen, and we spoke about a few cases. Let's discuss those cases in detail. So when we talk about the emission sources, I mean, of course, we already know that there is direct emission and indirect emissions. In case of direct emissions, because you are using the fuel directly or you're burning the fuel, you directly have its volume either in terms of tons, in terms of the volume, which is could be standard cubic foot, or it in terms of liters. So you know that you have these values and you know the calorific values or the emissions which is related to the burning of these fuels. You can directly calculate the emissions related to that. So that is one type of emission factors which is available. Uh, this these emission factors, you will find that these are universally accepted, whether US EPA or UK DEFRA or whoever releases it. There will not be much change with respect to region. So which is one of the reasons that US EPA is very popular, because they're using this and mostly people use it for that. On the other hand, when we come to the indirect emission calculation, uh, have a lot of range. So for example, for waste recycling, it can be the CO2 emissions, or here in this case, let me point out the CO2 equivalent emission in tons. Now this database came from US EPA, and that is what can be utilized in other region also. But being aware that the recycling methodologies would change in different regions. So wherever this database is available, we can region wise we should be utilizing that in particular. Similarly, you've got business travel where the air mile traveled. Here you can see one of the example which I was talking about. You have all three values, which is CO2, N2O, and CH4, and this is in kg of CO2, which needs to be converted to CO2 equivalent and then reported. Now, why I mentioned kg over here is because you will find this problem everywhere. Many a times you will have the emission factors either in tons or in kgs. Like for example, in case of US EPA, it is primarily in tons, whereas if you go to UKDFA, you will see many of them are in kgs. They are calculated in kgs. So when you're reporting everything in tons of CO2 for all the categories, you need to actually convert from kg to tons of CO2. So I know people do understand these conversions, but many a times during this process, it becomes cumbersome and it becomes difficult in order to factor all of this. And if you don't know your emission factor or what units it is utilizing, you'll definitely make that mistake, and this will come up during the audits. So the knowing the emission factor and the right emission, using the right emission factor is very important. For fuel and energy related activities, here there's an example of well to tank emission, which is 0.60664 kilograms of CO2. This is not with respect to the direct burning of gasoline or petrol. This is with respect to the refining of the petrol after extracting it from the earth and putting it in a tank. So this is rightly placed here. Fuel and energy related emission with respect to gasoline or petrol usage is to be rightly used. So one has to know which emission factor to put and where. Like for an example, when you talk about WTT fuel, here in the case of petrol, it will be directly written as petrol if you look at the emission database, emission factor database. If you don't know what WTT is, you might end up using this for actual gasoline burning, which is again a mistake. So it's important to know which factor to use where. Again, there's an example of electricity. So like for example, in case of India, there is 0.823. This is 2023 values. This is weighted average without renewable energy. And then there is another value which is 0.713, which includes renewable energy. So one has to decide whether they want to factor in the respective renewable energy which is fed to the grid or not, right? So all of these are very important factors with respect to choosing the right emission factor. Going one step deep, we just discussed electricity. So we did say with respect to market based, again, in case of, for example, in case of India, there are two different factors for market based. Uh, I'm so sorry. This is location based. This is not market based. This is location based. Please consider this correction. So in case of location based, what happens is India has already said 0.823, which is for weighted average without renewable energy, and 0.713, which is with renewable energy. When you talk about market based, it could be that you're getting the power from a power purchase agreement, and in that case, it can be an entirely clean power. So it could be zero emissions because it is entirely coming from wind power or let's suppose say solar power. But it can also be a mix of energy wherein you're getting renewable energy as a mix, where let's say 50% is coming from a coal power station and let's say 50% is coming from renewable energy. In that case, you should have very specific emission factors that you need to ask your provider, which you will factor into the platform or your calculator, and hence it should be calculated. I'm really sorry about market and location based. Please consider it reverse. Again, once you deep dive into the categories such as your, the spend based or activity based, right? So like in case of electricity, it is the activity base. In case of spend base, you might uh, you know purchase services, or you can purchase goods, which is another category in scope 3. So goods and services which you buy. So in that particular case, you may also report basis the amount that you spent on that particular commodity. So for an example, if you're buying cement, or if you're buying steel, or if you're buying computers, servers, furnitures, machine equipments and others, or you're buying services, for example, if you're taking environmental services for someone. So all of these can also be calculated in terms of the emission, and the emission factors are available. And most common example is the US EPA. US EPA would tell you, if you're buying cement of this particular value, what is the emissions related to that. And this is released year on year, and so you can also do you also calculate your emission based on spend based, right? So it's very important that people know that spend based calculation is also possible, not just activity based, right? So knowing the right emission factors, it's really important. So some of the common emission factor database, and Vivek, can you remind me how much time is remaining?
Yeah, we have another 10 minutes to go. Sorry,
That's
5 minutes
great.
to go.
All right, great. Thank you. So we still have some time for questions. So here's a list of some common emission factor databases. So in case of US EPA, you have the database existing from 1998. You have UK DEFRA, which is one of the common ones, which is used in the European region, but as well as, of course, UK, as well as some parts of Africa. In case of Europe, you have also the European Environmental Agency, EEA, which is available. The International Energy Agency is something which is universal. At the same time, IPCC also has these databases available. I've given the example of CEA, Central Electricity Authority, which releases only the electricity related databases. One of them I've shown you already. This is available since 2006. So these are some
Um,
common emission factor databases available to you.
Sorry to interrupt. I think your screen is frozen. Not sure.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
I'm
I
so
mean,
sorry. I'll
just
share it again.
yeah, there you go.
Is it
We
is
can
it
see it now.
moving?
Yeah, we can see
Okay.
it now. I
All
think
right.
you'll
All
have to
right.
go back a slide.
Sure. Is this available? Is this visible?
Activity versus pen now.
Yeah.
Yeah, now
Yeah,
it
this
is
is about.
EFDBs.
Okay. All right. Sure. Thank you. Thank you. So I'll just quickly repeat this. I think so. US EPA, UK DEFRA are one of the most common ones in terms of the emission factor databases, available from 1998 and 2002. In case of IEA and IPCC, these are available since 2002. And of course, in case of European Energy Agency, these databases are available from 1996. For specific databases with respect to electricity, I think this is available for, in case of India, from 2006. Now, these are not the only databases available out there. Each country might have their own database which they are releasing, which can be inclusive of both the fuel related or activity related databases, as well as electricity related databases. Of course, in case of electricity, it will be the individual countries. Mostly, they should be the primary source. If you get your hands on those databases, those are the best ones. Otherwise, you can go with the IEA database, which is universally accepted, which has emission factors for most of the countries. So these are some of the common emission factor databases that you can utilize. Uh, all right. Before I move on to talk about quickly talk about Sustainium and how we deal with it, are there any questions? Vivek and Ravi, you'd have to help me out on this.
No, right now we don't have any question. Chat box and a Q&A.
People can also raise their hand, and probably we can come back for questions in another 2 minutes before we talk about. But meanwhile, we'll talk about Sustainium and how we deal with it. So with respect to Sustainium, I think we've already shown you all of this before, but in case of Sustainium, all of the emission factor databases are kind of working at the back end, and you actually do not have to worry about the same. So we would display the right emission factor database for the right category. For an example, in case of the purchase goods and services, you will be shown UK DEFRA, or you can also be shown US EPA or BOVITSA, right? So all of these will be available to you when you are going to the right category. So you don't have to actually worry about it. Similarly, when you go to electricity, you will be shown, let's say, India CEA, such that you don't have to select it. You don't have to worry about which regions are available to you or not available to you. And all of this are pre-populated the moment you first enter our platform. You will be actually choosing which region are you going to enter the data from, and they'll be automatically mapped. So if for example, if you're talking about India, so automatically at the time of entering for electricity, you will be given the choice of India CEA. So that all of these things are very sorted. And of course, in the respective categories, the emission factor databases are available to you. Right now, we have USEP and UKDFI is being imported, but we will have these databases available for all the regions, all the important regions, which is wherever we operate. So I think this is what I wanted to convey, that we would be able to solve all of this, and you actually do not have to worry about the right emission factor database. We do that for you. All you have to do is know the right activity, know the right values to enter, and their units. So for an example, you should know that whatever I'm entering is in kg and not in tons if you're selecting the right units from the top down. So that's about what you need to worry about in terms of data entry. Of course, data collection is something one needs to worry about, and pretty soon I think we'll be moving towards automation as well.
Anshul,
So
I think your
yeah,
screen is frozen again.
is it moving now?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you need
we are
to.
on the last slide now, but I think you'll have to
Okay.
go back one slide.
All right. I if
And
there's no, yeah.
yeah, and also we have a question from Adebayo, who's from Nigeria. His question
Okay.
is, can I use other countries' emission factors for my calculation?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think I have on multiple occasion answered that. Yes, you can utilize other emission factor databases. For an example, the US EPA database is very commonly used across the world. It depends which activity you're talking about. So for example, if you're talking about fuel combustion would remain almost the same across the world. In case of Africa, what happens is mostly people utilize UK DEFRA, and that is what you can utilize. However, what happens is when you talk about electricity and other such activities, you have to use a local emission factor database particular to that particular country if that is available. If not, I think we will have to find a way to get those. But mostly these are available either through the government, or there are some research agencies which are giving the databases. So that is fairly possible. If any research agency is publishing it, probably it may not be available from 1990s, but it will be available for 3-4 years, which can be of use to you. I hope I've been able to answer your question. Great, thank you. Are there any other questions?
Not much. I don't see them.
All right. If there are no other questions, probably we'll close this session. We'll probably wait for another 30 seconds for any questions. People can raise their hand and we can unmute, and then we can answer some questions as well. Thank you, Manish. Thank you, Kumara. All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll close this session now. Thanks a lot. Have a nice evening.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you so much for your time. We have a question coming in.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Moment we are leaving. Yeah. I would like to make a suggestion. Can the webinar be organized to briefly explain the scopes from 1 to 3 and emission factor with an example? Surely we can do that. And you can also go to our recorded sessions. I mean, we've recorded previous sessions and those are available on our website as well. So yes, you can refer to those and we'll probably repeat these webinars very soon.
I'll be helping you with the link if that helps. Yeah.
Right. I think we'll close this session.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone.